Hello, this is Melinda Gossig from Yoga U Online, and I'm here today with Kristine Kaoverii Weber. Kristine has been teaching yoga for over 2 decades and training teachers since 2003. She is the founder of Subtle Yoga and the co-director of the Subtle Yoga Teacher Training for Behavioral Health Professionals program, the first RYT training of its kind in the US to be offered by a major continuing education organization. Kaoverii comes from a background that includes not only a wide variety of yoga skills, but Chinese bodywork and other holistic techniques. She presents workshops and trainings to yoga practitioners and healthcare professionals internationally. Thank you for joining me today, Kaoverii.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here.
So right now, neuroplasticity is a big buzzword, and it's easy to understand why. This idea that we can actually change how our brains work is very exciting. Could you shed some light on what we know about neuroplasticity and how it works?
Sure. Well, the first thing I want to say is I am not a neuroscientist. My profession is yoga, but I got really into this probably about 7 or 8 years ago. I started doing trainings at the Mountain Area Health Education Center here in Asheville. And it's the major continuing ed provider for the health professionals in the region where I live in Western North Carolina. And I thought, if I'm going to present there, I kind of have to know what I'm talking about. And so someone gave me the book, Rick Hanson's book many years ago, Buddha's Brain. And I thought, well, I have to start exploring this stuff. And that was a really good primer to get me to sort of get me into how mindfulness and yoga practices start to influence the brain. And from there, like just a ton of research started coming out. And I'm just so grateful to all the yogi researchers out there who are, really looking deeply into this stuff. The other piece to it, of course, is it's incredibly complex. I can't say that we really have a good grasp on how this stuff works, but we're starting to get a little peek behind the curtain because of the changes that have been made in technology, specifically the SPECT imaging scans and the functional MRI scans. Those have started to get researchers looking at all sorts of structural changes in the brain. And then additionally, the research that's been happening with the neurotransmitters and the neuropeptides. So kind of understanding what's going on with cortisol, for example, or with GABA, which is the brain's chief inhibitory neurotransmitter, or with brain-derived neurotropic factor, these different neurochemicals in the body that create changes in the mind. So there, we have had a significant amount of research in these past 8 or 10 years that's come out, and that's really been helpful for me in understanding this. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. But I also want to say that this idea that the brain can change is relatively recent in terms of Western scientific understanding. I think the yogis totally understood that the brain could change. I mean, I think that is what the practices were all about. So I don't know about you, but when I was in high school in the 80s, I remember I would come to school on a Monday and the guys would come in, they'd be like, yeah, I must have burned 1 million brain cells over the weekend, man, and you just thought, well, that was the end of your brain cells. You're stupid because you did too many drugs, And there was that commercial with the egg and the frying pan and this is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. Any questions? So there was that whole understanding that brain cells don't regenerate. And it was really the scientific community, when they first started to notice that the brain cells could regenerate, that research was rejected. And it wasn't until the 90s when it started to come out again that, oh, actually, this is accurate. Excuse me, this is accurate. The brain does start to change. Not only does it change, which would be neuroplasticity, it also continues to grow, which is called neurogenesis. So not only do we know the brain can change, it can also grow. When I first started studying this stuff, I remember the numbers were around 22 or 23, your brain stops developing. And then the number got pushed up to 25. And then they started to differentiate between men and women. Like women's brains seem to develop a little longer than men's, or I'm sorry, men's brains seem to take a little longer to develop than women's. And then the number got pushed up to around 28. And then a study I saw from London in 2010 said actually even into your 40s, the brain continues to develop and mature. So, you know, I mean, I think the next thing they're going to say is like your brain never stops developing. Pretty much, I think they're going to get to that point, you know. So I think it's really inspiring because it helps people to see in sort of like a really concrete, you know, you can always say like, oh, you're a nicer person because you practice yoga and I've seen the changes in you. But for people to see in this really concrete way, the research that has come out that has shown the changes in the gray matter in the certain structures of the brain, that's really hopeful, I think. And it helps people have that sense of like, okay, I can do something. It's very empowering. I can do something about the way that I feel. I can do something to make myself function better. Whereas that was not, you know, an option before. Now, I do want to say that, and again, with my limited understanding of this, I want to say that what we do understand is those first 3 years of development, that first window, 0 to 3, are super important in terms of laying down neural pathways. And then you have another big window, which is adolescence. And those are the times when really you're laying down the neural pathways when you're younger. And of course, all through childhood. And then in adolescence, they start doing something called neural pruning, which is where you're cutting off the things you're not using. So use it or lose it. You know, you start to lose some of those things. That's why, like, my dad wanted to learn how to play piano a couple of years ago. He's 78 now. And, you know, so he took up piano and got the books and got a piano and started studying. And he always wanted to learn how to play piano, but he quit after a little while. He said, it's just too hard. I can't learn this at my age, you know, and I wish he had, you know, pushed through and said, no, I can do it. But some things do get much more difficult to master as we get older. So, but that, you know, that doesn't mean we can't do it, but certainly we have to be realistic about what is possible. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, speaking of general growth, I know that for many of us, it's easy to get caught in cycles of worry and feelings of inadequacy and just plain old feeling down. And I know personally, I often replay moments from my day where I feel like I've made a mistake or, you know, if something went particularly poorly. And you mentioned author Rick Hansen, and he's referred to this as our brain's habit of reacting like Velcro to negative experiences and Teflon to positive ones.
Yes, I love that.
Do you have any information to share on that, or could shed some light on that?
Sure. So basically what he's talking about is that we are hardwired as humans for survival, right? Mm-hmm. So what that means is we have to pay attention to things in our life that might be threatening to us. And we don't have to pay attention to the good stuff, you know. So you might, as a yoga teacher, you might frequently have students coming to you after your class and saying, oh my gosh, Melinda, that was like the best yoga class ever. And I feel so good and I'm so relaxed and you're such a good teacher. And that happens to you multiple times in a week, for example, right? But then you get the one student who comes to you and she says, oh, Melinda, your voice, like it just really annoyed me the entire class, you know, or something like that, right? And do you remember all the nice things that people said? Of course not. And I'll tell you what, you remember her face and you remember how she said it. And even if you never see her again, you'll remember it for the next few years. And that can be a motivating thing to help you work on whatever about your teaching skills. But also it just is a reminder that that's not necessarily the reality of what's happening out there. It's just that your brain is hardwired to remember the negative experiences because that primitively was the way that we survived. You know, you're walking down a path and you see a snake in front of you and you jump because that's a threat. The next time you walk down the path, you might see a wiggly stick, but you jump because you remember the snake and you're hardwired for that kind of vigilance. Now, that being the case, that hardwiring is very healthy because it keeps us, it's what makes us survive. But when it starts to spill over into dysfunctional thoughts, anxiety, any of the kind of habits that we have of the mind that tend to interfere with our daily functioning, that's when it becomes problematic. And that's when we really have to work hard to start biasing more towards that positivity and optimism and hope. The good news is that there has been some research, small, it's nascent, but growing amounts of research that start to show that long-term yoga practice, the longer you've been practicing, the more you tend to bias towards the use of the left forebrain and more gray matter in the left forebrain. Why that's important, don't get too confused about the right-left brain thing, because that's a little too simplistic. And there is a very large body of research that shows that the left forebrain is connected to three main things: pro-social behavior, positive affect, and self-regulation. And those three things, that's really what makes you happy. And you're able to engage, pro-social behavior, you're able to engage with others, you play nicely with others. And then positive affect means you generally are in a place of feeling positive and hopeful. And then pro-social, and then self-regulation is the capacity to regulate your nervous system internally. So you don't need anything external, like a beer, or whatever, to regulate your nervous system. You're able to do that yourself. So that's exciting to me. That's hopeful to me that there's research that's showing that yoga practitioners who've been practicing for a long period of time tend to have more, spend more time, I guess you could say, in the left part of the forebrain. Yeah.
So is this an example of how yoga can actually use, leverage this principle of neuroplasticity?
Yes.
Exactly. That is very exciting.
Exactly. Additionally, that particular study, which was from the National Institute of Health, also showed that that's for people who have been practicing for a long time. But what it showed for people who maybe haven't been practicing that long, but practice regularly, is what starts to happen when you're practicing regularly is that you develop parts of the brain, these midline structures of the brain, that Bessel van der Kolk calls them the mohawk of self-awareness. Like this. He's really funny. So you start to develop these structures, and they include the things like the posterior cingulate cortex, if you want to know the details, orbitofrontal cortex, insula, and parts of the anterior cingulate cortex too. Anyway, they're these midline structures. So regular practice increases the gray matter in and the function of these midline structures. And why is that important? Because these midline structures essentially are our capacity to reflect on our body and ourself. So you know where your body is in space. That's proprioception. You know how your body feels. That's interoception. And you also know if your body is safe, which is called neuroception. Why are these things important? Because if you know where you are and you know who you are, you know what to do. You can make good decisions. You can make choices that are healthy. If you're cut off from how your body feels, you tend to make bad choices. You don't feel safe in your body, and you tend to have less mindfulness. So you sort of do the same dysfunctional behaviors and patterns over and over again. So this idea of regular practice increases our sense of self-awareness is also inspiring, and it's another reason why yoga really helps. And it doesn't mean you have to have 10,000 hours, right? The 10,000 hours is really important. We want to work towards that, but just with a little bit of practice, you start to see changes in the brain. Now, that reminds me of Richard Davidson's work at the University of Wisconsin, where he's the one who, originally put those shower caps on the monks of the what are they called? The little electrodes that went to his machine and showed him what was going on in the monks' brains. And to be in the study, you had to have 10,000 hours of training, which, by the way, is 5 years full-time job, right? So 10,000 hours of meditation all these monks had before they went in. And he started to show all these structural changes, positive structural changes in the brain. But then he went back and he said, well, what if we just teach somebody I think they taught them loving kindness meditation. And, but I could be wrong. It could be some kind of mindfulness or Buddhist-based meditation. And then after 2 weeks, they started to see structural changes in the brain. So that's really inspiring. It's not like you have to be this, expert Tibetan monk to start experiencing changes, so
Yeah.
So neuroplasticity can even happen after 2 weeks.
That is very exciting. And kind of springboarding off of that, I know psychology professor Martin Seligman has pointed out that there's this important difference between relieving misery and actually building happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to hear your take on that and how that fits into this, changing the brain to, I guess, hold a happier state.
Right. To positive, effective states, they might say. So yeah, his story is really interesting. Marty Seligman, he was the president of the American Psychological Association and realized that he was just helping his clients get to like zero with therapy. For various reasons since World War II, the focus of mental health has been on mental illness. The focus of mental behavioral health, the profession, has been really on mental illness. Like, how do we help people not be depressed? How do we help them not be anxious? How do we treat schizophrenia, psychosis, those sorts of, and of course, addiction. And really what Marty Seligman did was not something that, it was just like bring our awareness back to the idea that there's a difference between mental health and mental illness. There's a difference. And just because you get somebody to zero doesn't mean that they are leveraging their assets and transforming in a positive way and self-actualizing. When you look back at, and I talk about this a lot in my trainings, when you look at the history of mental health, the development of psychology in this country, it's largely related to the awareness of Westerners of Eastern practices. So Carl Jung was studying the Bhagavad Gita and the yoga tradition. I mean, there's a book that he gave 4 lectures called The Psychology of Kundalini Yoga. He deeply influences the transpersonal psychologists. And so transpersonal psychology, Maslow and this idea of the hierarchy of needs, and Kohlberg and this idea of a development of ethical engagement, all of that, in many ways, you can trace it back to the yogi's understanding of human psychology. So I always say that, like, Western psychology already, even before the infusion of mindfulness and yoga now and other Eastern practices, like dialectical behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy, all of these are deeply influenced by Eastern thought. And what the yogis were so good at was describing human potential. That's what they were so good at. They understood not just, the mental illness stuff, not as much, but more what mental health is and how you start looking at aspects of your life that need to be shifted and changed. It's not easy, but we know it's possible. And now what really we can, the wonderful information from neuroscience is really just a way for us to explain what the yogis were talking about. It's just the merging or the coming together of Western scientific thought with Eastern understanding of human psychology and potential. Yeah.
So I've read a little bit about this phenomenon called competitive plasticity, which is apparently part of the reason why bad habits are difficult to break or unlearn.
Yeah.
And there's a fancy phrase, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this idea of competitive plasticity and how
A
it
little
works.
bit. I mean, it's not, I think basically what that means is that you only have a certain amount of real estate in there. So, and it has to be, it tends to be focused on whatever you're using it for. So the other thing I think might be useful to understand here is the difference between attention networks and default or ruminative networks, because they often are seen as competitive. So you can either be focused and doing what you're doing and, kind of moving forward and with a clear sense of focus, or you can be in more of a state of rumination where you're kind of letting the mind go free. Ruminative networks, by the way, used to be thought of, these default networks used to be thought of as purely negative. That when somebody's not occupied with something, they're going into negative thinking patterns. But at Harvard, they recently said, no, that's not true. Ruminative networks are only negative if that's the way your brain biases, right? So that's the way that you've been programmed, that you've programmed your brain. So, or your brain has been programmed. So now they're understanding ruminative networks as actually really important for creativity. So ruminative networks are actually, it's a good place to be in this sort of free, open spaciousness where we're thinking, we're not so focused on a task, but we're letting ourselves expand into our creative potential. And I think that kind of spills over into this understanding of transient hypofrontality, which is the idea that the front brain is very busy doing, focusing task. But eventually, and through meditation practices, I believe we sort of drop from that focus of frontality and go into more of these ruminative or default networks. So that being said, it's not necessarily better. It's not necessarily, again, this is complicated stuff. It's not necessarily better that we're hyper focused and the attention networks are always on. That's not necessarily better because the mind has to go between these two states. But the capacity to focus is going to be important in the time when you need it. So developing those front brain networks is important, and that would be a process that happens through many of the integrated practices of yoga, asanas, pranayama, and meditation, certainly, and being mindful about your ethical values and that you're engaging in ethical behavior. And then talking about the ruminative networks, I mean, those networks start to evolve, I think. I really feel like it's an evolutionary process. It's a co-creative evolutionary process as you start getting into the deeper layers of meditation. So dharana, dhyan, and samadhi. Those are places where we start really, and dharana is kind of focused. So you're using some of the attention networks, but as you move, it's almost seamless to move from dharana to dhyan, to move from focus to sort of in this place of flow. The brain is you're going to see changes in brain activity at that point. And that, I just think that specifically meditation practices, and the research shows it too, that the meditation practices are the practices where we really start to see a development of both of those aspects, the attention networks as well as the ruminative networks. And I think more and more research is going to come out of that. There's been some interesting research lately that has come out looking at mindfulness and Buddhist-based meditation, and I'm thinking and comparing that to mantra-based meditation. And I'm thinking of two studies I know of. One's out of Italy and one's out of Israel. And they're looking about how some of the Buddhist mindfulness meditation is really focused on that front brain attention networks, whereas some of the more visualization kind of practices that arose from the tantric tradition are further back in the brain and have less to do with attention and more to do with this expansive opening of awareness. So I think that's going to be really fascinating to see what the researchers are coming out with, and not just saying like, oh, all meditation is good for attention, because it's not necessarily that simple, you know. So I don't know if that answers your question about competitive real estate. What is it? Competitive plasticity. I guess one other thing I could say is, if we are looking at it from the therapeutic side, and helping people who have ruminative thoughts, helping people who tend to bias towards negativity, then I think what you're doing is, by using these, using practices like mantra or positive affirmation, positive intention, especially when you're doing them with some kind of a posture, then you're giving the nervous system a chance to reorganize and to tell itself a different story, you know, from the story it's been ruminating on over and over again, whatever that is.
That makes a lot of sense. And this idea of stories and the ability of stories to shape how we perceive and experience the world is something that people are becoming more and more aware of. And in fact, the fact that these stories can actually change our brains. And would you like to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I find that to be some of the most inspiring and exciting stuff about neuroplasticity, this idea that our story creates who we are, you know, and the stories that we tell ourselves are creating our reality all the time. Not only the stories that we tell ourselves, but also the stories that we have heard and we've internalized. We've heard stories from our family, we've heard them from our culture, you know, so, and then some of those stories we take them in and they become us, you know, that idea that your biology is your biography, you know, your body tells the story of your life, and we have an opportunity to shift that story. And stories are really fascinating. I mean, when you listen to a story or watch a movie, an engaging movie, your body feels like it's in that place. Your body starts to experience those, the sensation. We all know that, you know, just watch a scary movie and you're starting to sweat and your eyes get wide and you're having a stress response reaction to it, which is very cathartic for some people, which is why, you know, teenagers love horror movies, you know, because they help them to move through some of that brain development. And the other piece about storytelling from others or from ourselves is how it affects the limbic system, of course, and how it affects the production of oxytocin. So oxytocin is sometimes called the love molecule. Paul Zak called it the love molecule. It's also or he calls it the moral molecule, actually, which is interesting. It's also the neurotransmitter or hormone that I guess would be called a neuropeptide because it's a hormone that it makes us connect with each other. So stories help us to connect to ourselves. And this links me back to, and so oxytocin, let me just finish with oxytocin. This links me back to oxytocin makes us feel a sense of belonging, a sense of connection, a sense of social engagement, a sense of happiness, a sense of calmness in the system. It's an important molecule. It used to be understood as like what you would release when you were breastfeeding a child or during sex, but now they understand it's happening in many other places as well. So what it ties me back into is this idea of oxytocin, is this idea that yoga is a practice of relationship and connection. You know, it's the relationship to each other, it's a relationship to ourselves, and it's a relationship to our higher power. And that relationship plays out through stories, you know, the way we talk to ourselves about ourselves, the way we talk to God or our higher power, the way we talk to each other, all of that is a reflection of these stories that we have told ourselves and internalized. And this links me back to what I did last summer with Yoga U, which was my course on the subtle body. And the yogis really understood the subtle body as the central nervous system. Like that was their model or their paradigm of the central nervous system. And they understood it through metaphor and through archetypal stories. And I go into the depths of those stories in that workshop. But that was their way of that was their story to tell. Whereas Western science has the story of molecules and neurotransmitters and structures of the brain to tell us that way. And that's an interesting story too. But I think that, the yoga practices were designed to change your story and to help you deepen your relationship and deepen your connection to your higher power, whatever that is for you. And so I think the yogis very much understood the workings of the central nervous system. They just didn't have the same language that we use to explain it. And they didn't have the functional MRIs and the other equipment to help sort of, help look into it more deeply. But the practices of yoga themselves were very much developed to help you change your story. And the way that you talk to yourself. And they were developed to help us, move through the stories that are dysfunctional so that we could find a story of peace and happiness and oneness. I mean, sounds utopic. And I think it was, but it really, the saints and the sages, they were just always pointing their finger at human potential. Like, that's where you can go. They weren't necessarily saying you're bad if you don't get there. They were saying that's the potential. And that's why I think yoga and positive psychology have so much in common, because it really is about this moving towards what is possible for you as a human being. And anything is possible. And now that we understand neuroplasticity, we know that we're not stuck and fixed in our old dysfunctional patterns, but things really can change.
Yeah. Great. You mentioned positive psychology. Could you just give a brief definition for those of our listeners who might not be familiar with the term?
Sure. I mean, it's basically looking at how to optimize. You could look it up, but the way that I understand it is how to optimize your strengths. It's really asset, but we would call this in psychology, you'd call this asset based. So it's looking at what your strengths are and optimizing those parts of yourself. And when you know who you are, right? I talked about knowing who you are and how yoga helps you to sort of understand who you are. When you know who you are, you start to understand your strengths better. When you understand your strengths better, then you can start to optimize or maximize or leverage those strengths and spend more time doing the things that you're really good at, because that's what's going to make you happy. Mm-hmm. So Marty Seligman talks about the pleasurable life and the life of eudaimonia or happiness, like the life of flow, and then the meaningful life. And he's researched all of them. And he says they're all good, but the meaningful life and the life of flow are the ones that really make people happier in the long run.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So obviously there's a lot of interesting research happening in this field of neuroplasticity right now. And are there any studies that you have found particularly interesting of late?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to share those. Again, in the bibliography, I'll share those. Check out this article called Neuroprotective Effects of Yoga Practice, Age, Experience, and Frequency-Dependent Plasticity. That came out from the National Institute of Health. So those two studies are a great place to start, just looking at these neuromechanisms and, what's being studied out there, what people are talking about. I think it's exciting. I think it's a really exciting time for this. And I think there's going to be just an explosion in research over the next few years. Yeah.
Great. Can you actually repeat that first study? Because I think we had a glitch and I'm not sure if the recorder picked it up, but just in case.
So it's a study from the Kripalu Research Consortium. It's called Potential Self-Regulatory Mechanisms of Yoga for Psychological Health.
Okay.
And the author is Gard, G-A-R-D.
Great. So you already mentioned this, and we're very excited about it. You have a course coming up here with Yoga U called Change Your Story, Change Your Life, Yoga, Neuroplasticity, and the Art of Conscious Transformation. Could you share with our listeners a little bit of what they could expect to learn in the course?
Sure. So one of the things I really am passionate about is helping yoga teachers learn to translate some of this stuff to make it accessible to your students so that your students are more interested in practicing yoga. I feel like that's one thing that I really want to focus on, and I want you to come away from the course feeling like, oh, not only was that interesting information, but also now I have some really concrete things, some really concrete ways to explain to people why I do things the way I do. One of the models I like to use with people, which is super simple, but took me a long time to come up with, is I write the word yoga on the whiteboard, and then over here I draw a line and it says physical fitness. And over here I draw a line and it says resilience. And then I draw two circles because they connect with each other. There is a little overlap between fitness and resilience for sure. But people teaching yoga for fitness have a different goal, and people going to yoga for fitness have a different goal than people teaching and going to yoga for resilience. And I would put the resilience in the yoga therapy category for the most part, So I'm working on people to help them perhaps heal a physical injury and be more resilient in that part of their body. I'm helping them to heal anxiety or depression or other emotional challenges to help them be more resilient in their mind. And I'm helping them leverage their spiritual aspects. So that kind of simple diagram is sort of an example of some of the ways that I break down yoga to help people to understand what you're doing when you move slowly, when you stop to notice how your body feels, when you spend time doing pranayama practices and meditation practices, which sometimes are thought of as sort of like, oh yeah, I'll do that someday, but right now I just want the workout, What you're doing when you spend time doing those things you're starting to affect neuroplasticity and neurogenesis in a way that you may not be doing with regular exercise. You might be one of those exercisers who spends a lot of time feeling where your body is, that might be happening. But I would suggest, and I would offer just anecdotally from working with so many hundreds of people over the years, that many people use yoga in that kind of fitness way as a way to bypass some of the feelings in their body. So it's sort of a way to manage traumatic experiences or manage mental health issues without necessarily starting to heal and transform them. And so in this series, I want to give you some really concrete ways to talk about this stuff with people. And then we're going to have 4 classes. And in those 4 classes, I'll be presenting the research. But we're going to break it down essentially into 4 different areas or 4 different webinars. And I'll also be showing you practices too, but we're going to talk about that mohawk of self-awareness a little bit. And we'll talk about mind-body awareness, mindfulness, and sensory motor integration. So we'll talk about, I don't mean sensory motor integration in a pathologic sense. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about using the sense organs, which the yogis called the gyanendriyas, and the motor organs, which they called the karmendriyas. How do we use those tools to integrate information through yoga practice? And then the 3rd session, we'll talk about top-down, bottom-up integration, and I'll explain what that means, but it's basically using front brain systems and using body in a coordinated way and sort of hooking into the feedback loops that yoga provides. And then the last session is going to be about leveraging spiritual assets, and I'll present some of the research on the benefits of spirituality for both physical and mental health. There's a large body of research on that. So that's pretty much it for the 4 classes. It'll be, kind of I've tried to take as much of the research as I could find and break it down into stuff that's accessible and that you can also use for your clients, and your students. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Kaoverii. We are very much looking forward to it.
Good. Me too.
Thank you for taking time to meet with me today.
Okay, well, thank you. It's been fun. And I hope you all can make it to the course. Okay, namaste.